3 years, she was married to a man who never truly saw her. Then one morning, her wedding ring disappeared, and everything changed.
Lady Evangeline Hartwell sat perfectly still in the morning room, her untouched tea growing cold beside a window that overlooked gardens she was no longer permitted to tend. 3 years had passed since the wedding, and in all that time, she had spoken fewer than 200 words to her husband. She'd counted them once, during a particularly long winter, when the silence had become so heavy, it felt like another person living in the house. The Duke of Ashford, Sebastian Hartwell, was not cruel in the way people imagine cruelty. He didn't raise his voice or his hand. He simply existed in a different world, one where Evangeline was a porcelain figure that had been placed in his home by obligation and nothing more. Their marriage had been arranged to save her family's crumbling estate, from a transaction wrapped in white silk and orange blossoms that fooled no one, least of all the bride. What haunted Evangeline most wasn't the loneliness itself, but the specific way Sebastian would pass her in the corridors. His eyes would drift just past her left shoulder, as if she were made of the same stone as the walls. She'd tried everything in those first months. She'd learned his favorite dishes and requested the cook prepare them. She'd read all the books in his study so they might have something to discuss. She'd even commissioned a portrait of his late mother as a gift, thinking perhaps shared. 3 years had passed since the wedding, and in all that time, she had spoken fewer than 200 words to her husband. She'd counted them once, during a particularly long winter, when the silence had become so heavy, it felt like another person living in the house. The Duke of Ashford, Sebastian Hartwell, was not cruel in the way people imagine cruelty. He didn't raise his voice or his hand. He simply existed in a different world, one where Evangeline was a porcelain figure that had been placed in his home by obligation and nothing more. Their marriage had been arranged to save her family's crumbling estate, from a transaction wrapped in white silk and orange blossoms that fooled no one, least of all the bride. What haunted Evangeline most wasn't the loneliness itself, but the specific way Sebastian would pass her in the corridors. His eyes would drift just past her left shoulder, as if she were made of the same stone as the walls. She'd tried everything in those first months. She'd learned his favorite dishes and requested the cook prepare them. She'd read all the books in his study so they might have something to discuss. She'd even commissioned a portrait of his late mother as a gift, thinking perhaps shared grief might build a bridge between them. He'd thanked her for the portrait, with the same distant politeness he used with the stable master. The other servants had learned not to mention her presence when Sebastian was near. It was easier that way, Mrs. Crowley, the housekeeper, had explained gently, to simply let his grace move through his days undisturbed. Evangeline had become a secret kept by the entire household, a living woman turned into something people spoke around rather than about. But there was one person who had noticed her, really noticed her, and that was where the trouble had begun. Thomas Ashford was Sebastian's younger brother, returned from his travels abroad just 6 months ago. He was everything the Duke wasn't, warm where Sebastian was cold, curious where his brother remained distant. Thomas had walked into the morning room on his second day home and done something no one else had done in 3 years. He'd actually looked at Evangeline, met her eyes, and smiled like she was a person worth seeing. "You're drowning in here," he'd said, so not as criticism, but as simple observation. "Come walk with me in the gardens. The roses are finally blooming, and someone should enjoy them." At first, Evangeline had refused, terrified of overstepping some invisible boundary. But Thomas had a way of making everything seem permissible, even necessary. The walks became weekly, then daily. He brought her books from the village, not dusty old volumes about estate management, but novels full of adventure and feeling. He asked her questions about her childhood, her dreams, the things she missed about her family's old home before debt had swallowed it whole. For the first time since her wedding day, Evangeline remembered what it felt like to be seen. They were careful, always proper, never alone in ways that could invite scandal. But Sebastian's sister-in-law, Lady Beatrice, now had eyes like a hawk and a tongue sharp enough to draw blood. She'd noticed the way Thomas laughed at Evangeline's stories, the way his hand lingered just a moment too long when helping her over the garden stones. And she'd gone straight to Sebastian with her suspicions, painted in the darkest colors her imagination could conjure. That was when Sebastian had finally looked at Evangeline directly for the first time in their marriage. Not with warmth or even anger, but with something worse, cold assessment, like she was a horse that had gone lame and needed to be dealt with. "You will cease these walks," he'd said, standing in the doorway of her chambers. "Thomas leaves for London in the morning. You will not correspond with him. You will remember your position in this house." He'd left before she could explain that there was nothing improper happening, that Thomas had simply been kind when kindness was all she had. Sebastian wouldn't have believed her anyway. He'd already decided what she was, just as he'd decided 3 years ago that she wasn't worth knowing. That night, Evangeline had locked herself in her room and done something she hadn't allowed herself to do since childhood. She'd cried until her throat was raw, until the embroidered pillowcases were damp with tears that kept coming like they'd been stored up for years. And somewhere in those dark hours, something inside her had quietly broken. The next morning, Thomas was gone. No goodbye, no explanation. The house felt twice as empty as before, because now Evangeline knew exactly what she was missing. And she'd tasted friendship, maybe even the beginning of something deeper. And now she was expected to go back to being furniture. The weeks that followed blurred together in shades of gray. Evangeline stopped going to the morning room. She stopped requesting books from the library. She ate mechanically, slept poorly, and moved through the halls like her own ghost. Mrs. Crowley tried to draw her out with gentle concern, but Evangeline had retreated somewhere even kindness couldn't reach. It was during one of these hollow days, while Evangeline was sorting through old letters from her mother, that she noticed her wedding ring felt loose. She'd lost weight without realizing it, her body consuming itself in the absence of joy. The ring, a heavy gold band with the Hartwell family crest, spun freely on her finger now, threatening to slip off with every careless gesture. She should have had it resized. That would have been the practical thing, the proper thing. But Evangeline found she didn't care anymore. Let it fall off. Let it disappear into the cracks of this miserable house. What did it matter? The ring was just another symbol of a promise no one had kept, least of all the man who'd placed it there. On a Tuesday morning in late September, Evangeline woke to rain hammering against the windows and a strange clarity settling over her thoughts. She couldn't continue like this, half alive in a house full of people who'd learned to unsee her. Something had to change, even if she didn't yet know what that change would look like. As she dressed herself, her lady's maid had stopped coming weeks ago when Evangeline had told her the help wasn't needed, and made her way down to breakfast. Sebastian was already there, hidden behind his newspaper as always, eating in the methodical way he did everything. Evangeline poured herself tea with hands that shook slightly, though she couldn't have said if it was from nerves or hunger. That's when she noticed it. Her left hand looked strange as she lifted the teacup, and it took her several seconds to understand why. The ring was gone. Her wedding band had slipped off sometime during the night, lost somewhere between her bed and this table. And the strangest part was that she felt nothing. No panic. No urgency to search for it. Just a distant, floating sense of inevitability, like watching a ship sink slowly into the ocean. Sebastian lowered his newspaper just enough to glance at her, and his eyes went immediately to her bare left hand. Something flickered across his face, too quickly to identify, and then it was gone, replaced by his usual mask of indifference. But for the first time in 3 years, he didn't look away. Sebastian Hartwell had built his entire life around control. Every hour scheduled, every emotion carefully managed, every aspect of his dukedom running with the precision of a well-oiled machine. He'd inherited the title at 19 when his father had died suddenly, and he'd learned quickly that sentiment was a luxury he couldn't afford. The estate had been drowning in debt, the tenants suffering, the family name barely worth the paper it was printed on. So he'd become stone. Hard, unbreakable, efficient. He'd turned the Ashford fortune around through sheer force of will and careful calculation. And when the time came to marry, he'd chosen the same way he chose everything else. Logically, practically, without the mess of feeling to complicate matters. Lady Evangeline's family had needed money. He'd needed an heir eventually. It was simple mathematics. Except nothing about the past 3 years had been simple, and Sebastian was self-aware enough to know the fault was entirely his own. He told himself at first that distance was kindness, that a marriage based on transaction deserved honesty, not false pretenses of affection. He'd convince himself that Evangeline would be happier, left to her own devices, free to run the household as she wished without the burden of his company. He'd been so certain he was doing the noble thing by not pretending their arrangement was something it wasn't. But watching her bare hand tremble as she set down her teacup, Sebastian felt something crack in the careful walls he'd built. When had she gotten so thin? When had the light gone out of her eyes? He'd been so busy managing his estate, his responsibilities, his carefully controlled world, that he hadn't actually looked at his wife in months, maybe longer. The missing ring should have been a small thing, a minor domestic issue easily resolved. But Sebastian found himself staring at her empty finger like it was a wound that wouldn't stop bleeding. "Your ring," he said, and his voice came out rougher than intended. It was probably the first time he'd initiated conversation with her since Thomas had left. Evangeline didn't meet his eyes. "Yes, it seems I've lost it." The flatness in her tone bothered him more than the missing ring itself. There was no apology in her voice, no distress, just empty acknowledgement. Like she was commenting on the weather. "When did you last have it?" Sebastian asked, setting down his newspaper completely. Mrs. Crowley, who was refilling the coffee, looked startled enough to nearly drop the pot. "I don't know," Evangeline said quietly. "Last night, I suppose. Or maybe the night before. Does it matter?" The question hung between them like an accusation. Sebastian opened his mouth to respond, then closed it again. What could he say? That of course it mattered, when he'd spent 3 years acting like she herself didn't matter. That a piece of gold was important, when he'd treated the woman wearing it like a stranger in his own home. "I'll have the servants search your chambers," he said finally, falling back on the practical solution, because that's what he always did, when he didn't know how to handle actual human emotion. "As you wish," Evangeline said, and rose from the table without touching her breakfast. She moved toward the door with the slow, careful steps of someone who'd learned to take up as little space as possible. Sebastian watched her go and felt an unfamiliar tightness in his chest. When had she started walking like that? When had she stopped being the bright-eyed young woman who'd smiled nervously at their wedding, hopeful despite everything? He realized with sudden, uncomfortable clarity that he'd done that to her, not through cruelty or violence, but through something worse, through systematic, deliberate indifference. The search for the ring became an obsession that surprised everyone, most of all Sebastian himself. He insisted on personally overseeing every inch of Evangeline's chambers being examined. The servants whispered about it in corners, confused by the Duke's sudden interest in his wife's belongings after years of studied neglect. They found nothing. The ring had vanished as completely as if it had never existed. On the third day of searching, Sebastian did something he hadn't done in 3 years. He knocked on Evangeline's sitting room door and actually waited for permission to enter. "Come in," her voice called, sounding startled. She was seated by the window with embroidery in her lap, though the hoop had clearly been sitting untouched for some time. The afternoon light fell across her face in a way that made her look almost translucent, like she was slowly fading into the wallpaper. "We haven't found it yet," Sebastian said, standing awkwardly just inside the doorway. "But I've sent for a jeweler from London. He can craft a replacement." "That's not necessary," Evangeline said, setting aside her embroidery. "I don't really need it." "You're my wife. You need a ring." "Do I?" The question came out sharper than she probably intended, and Sebastian saw color rise in her pale cheeks. "Forgive me, Your Grace. That was inappropriate." "Sebastian," he said quietly. "You could call me Sebastian. You're my wife, not my servant." Evangeline laughed, and it was the saddest sound he'd ever heard. "Am I? Your wife, I mean? Because I've spent 3 years in this house, and I'm not entirely sure what I am anymore. Not a wife. Not really a duchess. Just sort of a well-dressed ghost who happens to live in the East Wing." The words hit Sebastian like physical blows. He wanted to argue, to deny, but everything she said was undeniably true. He'd turned her into a ghost through sheer neglect. "I know I've been," he started, then stopped. "Because how did you apologize for erasing someone's entire existence?" "I've been unfair to you." "Unfair," Evangeline repeated softly. "That's a kind way to put it." Sebastian took a step closer, driven by an impulse he didn't fully understand. "Thomas told me something before he left. He said I was wasting something precious through cowardice. I didn't understand what he meant at the time." Evangeline's head snapped up, her eyes finally meeting his. "You spoke with Thomas?" "Briefly. He was quite angry with me, actually. Said I was a fool and several other things I probably deserved to hear." Sebastian moved to the chair across from her, sitting down without invitation. "He also said that you were the kindest person he'd ever met, and that any man who couldn't see that didn't deserve the title of gentleman, much less Duke." Tears welled up in Evangeline's eyes, but she blinked them back furiously. Thomas was too generous in his assessment. "No," Sebastian said firmly. "I don't think he was generous enough. And I think I've been blind for 3 years. Because looking at you, really looking at you, would have meant admitting what a mess I'd made of everything." "Why now?" Evangeline whispered. "Why do you suddenly care because a piece of jewelry went missing? That ring never meant anything. It was just part of the transaction like everything else." Sebastian flinched at that, but he didn't look away. "Because seeing your hand without it made me realize I'd already lost something far more valuable. And I didn't even notice when it happened." The silence that followed was heavy with 3 years of unsaid words, of missed opportunities, of casual cruelties committed through absence rather than action. Finally, Evangeline spoke, her voice barely audible. "What do you want from me, Sebastian?" It was the first time she'd used his given name, and hearing it in her voice did something strange to his heart. "I want," he said slowly, "the chance to start over. Not to erase these 3 years. I know I can't undo that damage, but to try to be the husband I should have been from the beginning. I don't know if I can do that," Evangeline said honestly. "I don't know if I have anything left to give you. You broke something in me, Sebastian. Not all at once, but piece by piece, day by day, until I stopped recognizing myself." The truth of it made Sebastian want to leave, to retreat back into the comfortable numbness he'd lived in for years. But he forced himself to stay, to sit with the discomfort of what he'd done. "Then let me try to help you find those pieces," he said quietly, "however long it takes." Evangeline studied his face for a long moment, searching for sincerity, or perhaps just trying to decide if she had the strength to hope again. Sebastian let her look, didn't hide behind his usual mask of indifference. "The ring is probably in the garden," she said finally. "I went walking there 3 nights ago when I couldn't sleep. It must have slipped off then." "Then we'll search the gardens tomorrow," Sebastian said. "Together, if you'll allow it." Evangeline nodded slowly, and though she didn't smile, something in her expression softened just slightly. It wasn't forgiveness. That would take far more than pretty words and sudden attention. But it was, perhaps, the smallest beginning of possibility. And for the first time in 3 years, Sebastian felt something other than the cold efficiency he'd wrapped around himself like armor. He felt hope, fragile and terrifying, that maybe it wasn't too late after all. The morning dawned gray and misty, the kind of weather that made everything look softer around the edges. Sebastian found himself awake before sunrise, which was unusual for a man who typically slept the efficient 6 hours his schedule demanded. He'd laid awake most of the night thinking about Evangeline's face when she'd finally said his name, the way it had sounded both foreign and achingly right. He dressed carefully, choosing simpler clothes than usual. No formal jacket, just shirt sleeves and a vest. If they were going to search the gardens together, he didn't want to look like he was conducting a state business. He wanted to look like a man spending time with his wife. The thought still felt strange. Wife. He'd used the word 1,000 times in legal documents and formal introductions, but he'd never really thought about what it meant. Partnership, companionship, and someone to share the weight of life with instead of carrying everything alone. Evangeline was already in the breakfast room when he arrived, wearing a simple pale blue dress that made her look younger somehow. She'd pinned her dark hair back loosely, and Sebastian noticed for the first time that she had a small scar just above her left eyebrow. 3 years of marriage, and he was still discovering the most basic things about her. "Good morning," he said, and the words felt monumentally inadequate. "Good morning," she replied, not quite looking at him. Her hands were wrapped around a teacup like she was trying to draw warmth from it, even though the room wasn't cold. They ate in silence, but it was a different kind of silence than before. Not the vast, empty distance of 2 strangers, but something more tentative. Sounded like 2 people learning a new language together and not quite sure of the right words yet. After breakfast, they walked to the gardens together. Sebastian noticed that Evangeline kept a careful distance between them, not quite walking beside him, but not trailing behind either. The mist was burning off slowly, revealing roses that were past their peak bloom, petals scattered across the stone pathways, like confetti from a celebration no one had attended. "I used to love these gardens," Evangeline said quietly as they reached the center fountain. "When I first arrived, I thought they were the most beautiful thing I'd ever seen. I'd spend hours out here, imagining all the parties we might host, the children who might play here someday." She paused, her voice catching slightly. "Oh, that seems like a lifetime ago now." Sebastian felt guilt twist in his stomach. "I didn't know you liked gardening." "You never asked," Evangeline said simply, without accusation. Just fact. They began searching methodically, Sebastian working through the rose beds, while Evangeline checked around the fountain and benches. The ring was small enough that it could be anywhere, buried in soil or hidden beneath fallen leaves. After an hour of searching, Sebastian's back was aching, and his hands were dirty, and he couldn't remember the last time he'd done any physical labor that wasn't riding or fencing. "This is hopeless," Evangeline said finally, sitting down on a stone bench with a heavy sigh. "It's been 3 days. Some bird has probably carried it off by now, or it's buried so deep we'll never find it." Sebastian came to sit beside her, closer than he would have dared yesterday. Then I'll have a new one made, better than the original. It won't change anything, Evangeline said, turning to look at him directly for the first time that morning. A new ring won't fix 3 years of loneliness, Sebastian. It won't make me forget what it felt like to be invisible in my own home. I know, Sebastian said, and the admission cost him something. He'd spent so long being right about everything, being in control, that confessing failure felt like stripping off his own skin. I know a ring can't fix it. I'm not sure anything can fix it. But I'd like to try anyway. Why? The question was genuine, searching. What changed? Because if this is just guilt, if you're only paying attention to me because Thomas made you feel bad, or because losing the ring embarrassed you somehow, then I'd rather you just go back to ignoring me. At least that was honest. Sebastian took a breath, choosing his words carefully. Do you know why I stayed away from you? Evangeline shook her head. Because you terrified me, he admitted. From the moment we married, you looked at me with these hopeful eyes, like you expected me to be someone I didn't know how to be. My father was never affectionate, never warm. He taught me that dukes don't have the luxury of softness. And I believed him. I thought if I kept my distance, if I stayed focused on duty and responsibility, that would be enough. But it wasn't, Evangeline said softly. No, it wasn't. And somewhere along the way, I stopped being distant to protect myself and started being distant because it was easier than admitting I'd made a terrible mistake, or easier than facing the fact that I'd married a kind, intelligent, beautiful woman and treated her like an inconvenience. Evangeline's eyes filled with tears. You really think those things? About me? I do, Sebastian said, and reached out tentatively to take her hand. She didn't pull away, though he felt her fingers tremble in his. I think I've thought them for a long time, but I was too much of a coward to say them. Too afraid that if I admitted I cared, I'd have to face how badly I'd already ruined things. A tear slipped down Evangeline's cheek, and Sebastian felt something in his chest crack open. He'd made her cry. Not just today, but probably hundreds of times over 3 years. Quiet tears in empty rooms when there was no one to comfort her. I'm so sorry, he whispered. Evangeline, I'm so desperately sorry for every day I made you feel unwanted. You deserved so much better than what I gave you. Evangeline was quiet for a long moment, tears streaming freely now. Then she said something that surprised him. I'm angry at you, Sebastian. I'm so angry I sometimes can't breathe. But I'm also tired of being angry, tired of being lonely, tired of living like a ghost. Then tell me how to make it right, Sebastian said urgently. Whatever it takes, however long, I'll do it. Start by actually seeing me, Evangeline said, her voice stronger now despite the tears. Not just looking, but seeing. Ask me questions. Tell me about your day. Eat dinner with me. Walk with me. Be my friend before you try to be my husband, because we never had that foundation to begin with. I can do that, Sebastian said. So, I want to do that. They sat together on the bench as the mist continued to clear, and Sebastian told her things he'd never told anyone, about the pressure of inheriting so young, about the nights he'd laid awake, terrified the estate would fail despite his best efforts, about how Thomas had always been the charming one, and he'd been the responsible one, and somewhere he'd forgotten how to be anything else. Evangeline listened, really listened, and then she began to share too, about missing her family, about the hobbies she'd abandoned because there was no one to share them with, about the loneliness that had become so constant it felt like part of her bones. The sun was fully up when Sebastian noticed something glinting near the base of a rose bush they'd already searched. He stood and walked over, his heart suddenly pounding. There, see, half buried in dark soil, was the ring. He picked it up carefully, wiping away the dirt with his thumb. The gold was scratched and dull. 3 years of being worn by someone who'd stopped caring about it. It needed to be cleaned, probably resized, definitely polished. Sebastian carried it back to where Evangeline sat watching him. Instead of just handing it to her, he did something he hadn't done since their wedding day. He knelt down in front of her, the damp ground seeping through his trousers. "Evangeline Hartwell," he said softly, holding up the ring. "I know I don't deserve another chance. I know I've wasted 3 years we can never get back. But if you'll have me, really have me, so not just as a name on a marriage certificate, but as a true partner, I promise to spend every day trying to be worthy of you." Fresh tears spilled down Evangeline's cheeks, but this time she was smiling through them. That was much better than the first proposal. "That's because the first time I was proposing a business arrangement," Sebastian said. "This time I'm asking the woman I love to build a life with me." Evangeline's breath caught. "You love me?" "I think I've loved you for longer than I knew," Sebastian admitted. "I was just too stubborn and scared to recognize it." Evangeline held out her left hand, and Sebastian slipped the dirty, imperfect ring back onto her finger. It was still too loose, still needed work. But it sat there like a promise of something better. "We're going to have to work at this," Evangeline said seriously. "It won't be easy. Some days I'm going to still be angry about the past. Some days you're probably going to fall back into old habits. This isn't a fairy tale where everything's perfect just because we talked about it." "I know," Sebastian said, rising to sit beside her again. "But I'd rather work at a real marriage than live comfortably in a false one." Evangeline leaned her head against his shoulder tentatively, and Sebastian wrapped his arm around her, like she was something precious he'd almost lost. Which, he supposed, she was. They sat like that for a long time, watching the gardens wake up fully in the morning light. There was still so much to figure out, so many conversations to have, so much trust to rebuild. But for the first time in 3 years, both of them felt like they were finally home. "Sebastian?" Evangeline said softly. "Why, yes. Thank you for finding me, even if I had to lose the ring first for you to realize I was missing." Sebastian pressed a kiss to the top of her head, breathing in the scent of her hair. "I'll never stop looking for you now, I promise." And somewhere in the gardens around them, the roses bloomed on, indifferent to human drama but beautiful nonetheless. A reminder that even things that seem past saving can sometimes surprise you with new growth.